Hello, I'm so incredibly delighted to welcome, first of all, our guests today, but then, of course, everyone who is joining us in this room, but also virtually, welcome. This is the Behavioral Science for Inclusive Organizations seminar. It's part of the seminar series of the Women in Public Policy program and the Wiener Center for Social Policy. Today, we're incredibly excited to have three guests from, I want to say, from three different parts of the world. I wanted to say from three continents, but then I held myself back because, of course, nobody represents a continent. But in any case, it is literally true that we have people from three different continents, which I'll introduce in just a moment. So we'll talk about the power of data today, data that measure representation in organizations around the world. And how we will structure the seminar is that each of our guests will share for about 10 minutes what their work is all about. And then we will have a bit of a conversation. Might ask them a question or two, and then we'll open the floor to the audience in this room and virtually. So if you're part of our virtual audience, again, a warm welcome to wherever you join us from. Please work with Siri, who is going to monitor your questions and send them in through the chat, I think, correct? Through the chat. And Siri will try to do her best to monitor and maybe combine a few questions and pick the most prevalent ones. Okay, so with that, and without further ado, let me introduce our guests, and I'm going to go in alphabetical order and start with Nkiru Balonwu. Nkiru joins us from Nigeria. She heads there Africa Soft Power. Africa Soft Power Group actually is the umbrella organization of a number of gender-focused organizations on the continent, including, for example, African Women on Board. Nkiru is an advisor to quite a number of organizations. And before that, she was the CEO of Spinlet, which at the time was Africa's largest music streaming app. She has a doctorate from the University of California, a number of other degrees, and was a fellow here at the Mossavar Rahmani Center. And that's, in fact, where we got to know each other. So welcome, Nkiru. Our second guest is Mia Perdomo. Mia joins us from Colombia. I'm just assuming you're all at home, but of course you might be anywhere in the world the way I know you. But originally, at least from Colombia, Mia is the co-founder and CEO of Aequales and the co-creator of the PAR ranking that I'm sure you'll learn a bit more about. It is the largest measurement of corporate gender equality in Latin America. Mia is a psychologist with a master in human rights, fellow at Georgetown and Columbia University, and also was in an executive program here at the Kennedy School for the Young Global Leaders of the World Economic Forum, where I had the pleasure of getting to know her. So welcome back, Mia. Aniela Unguresan is the founder of the EDGE Certified Foundation, in many ways custodians of the world's leading DEI certification standard and the CEO of EDGE Strategy, provider of EDGE Empower and DEI data-led tech solutions for businesses. Aniela is an economist by training, and her passions are data and intersectional equity, and bringing this all together in a sustainable way for companies around the world. Aniela's clients now span more than 250 leading organizations, 57 countries, 27 industries, including companies such as L'Oréal, Chevron, Allianz, Moncler, Lavazza, UNICEF, World Bank, etc. So we're incredibly pleased. Welcome, Aniela. Welcome, Mia. Welcome, Nkiru, to have our guests with us today. Again, we'll now turn it over to Nkiru to get us started. Then Mia will offer a few remarks, and then Aniela will close us off. I'm going to turn the floor to Nkiru. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Iris. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for having me to the room. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm speaking from Lagos, Nigeria. I'm sitting in my living room right now. So again, thanks. I'm just sort of like gonna just do a quick origin story in terms of my personal journey with data. So as Iris said, I used to run a company called Spinlet, which was at the time, like we called it the iTunes of Africa. And then I moved from there to begin a consulting firm on stakeholder engagement, which was called at the time RDF. And my journey around women and data, before then I used to teach at the University of Lagos, and I used to teach gender and law. And then so I went in the private sector and I became a leader, and I was struggling. I had very, very serious struggles in terms of navigating the boardroom, navigating investors from an Africa perspective, but also I was sort of doing a lot of work around the world, so traveling a lot. And so my question then became, how were other women leaders, managing themselves? This was before Me Too. So how were all the other women leaders dealing with the issues that I was experiencing? I wasn't sure if it was about me and my problems or if it was like a general thing. So I started asking questions. And we found that, and so we did a lot of surveys and focus groups and questionnaires. And we found that women would say one thing privately about their journey in leadership, but publicly the female leaders would say something else about how they worked really hard and everything was all nice. But privately with a group of women, they'd say, oh, this is really happening. This is, and we found that one of the key issues, the three key issues were around harassment at work, mostly sexual harassment, but also a lot of bullying as well. Healthcare issues and finance, money, pay were key issues that we found. So we then decided to start our program, which was called African Women on Boards at the time, and then later dropped the S because we found that this was an issue that women were facing around, not just boardrooms, but across communities. And so again, the key question was data, how were women? So going back a little bit, the conversation was always been around, when it comes to gender, at least from an Africa perspective, around social and development. So for decades we've had organizations working around social issues, development issues, and sort of like not seeing real changes. So our focus has been women in the workplace and how they're navigating or sort of like moving around the career issues. And so again, systematically, it was literally harassment was key issue, key issue healthcare, key issue money. And so we then sort of asked questions with, the men as like, how are we sort of like engaging women on the topics? And we found that at least on the continent, on the African continent, people normally glazed over around the conversation when it comes to gender. And so we started a program which we called at the beginning, Violence Against Women in the Workplace. That didn't really sit well with private sector. Language was something that we found became critical. So we reframed it to call it safety in the workplace, and that sat better. Again, the data said, language was critical in terms of moving the needle from an Africa perspective. So we then found that, how we sort of pronounce things around gender was something that was very serious. And the whole idea of men glazing over, and of course on the continent, I think everywhere in the world, men really generally control private sector. Our focus has been, my personal focus is actually women in the workplace and private sector, because that's my core interest. But also most of the work on the continent has been done around social issues, so around grassroots women. And so from our perspective, in terms of actually really moving the needle, we felt that by engaging not just bottom up, but engaging top bottom, we could actually sort of impact policy differently. If we had women leaders in core rooms, we could actually sort of like change things that then impacted grassroots women equally. And so again, we then sort of like dove into the private sector, how our private sector navigating issues around gender in the context of Africa. And one of the core learnings that we had about, a few years just before COVID was the whole conversation around, we said, our initial pronouncements were, creating conducive working environments for women to thrive. And we didn't really get far with that. So we had a few conversations with some of the CEOs down this way. And we tweaked language again to creating conducive environments for both men and women to thrive. And I think at that point that we then realized, at least from an Africa perspective, but it would be interesting to hear what the other Aniela and Mia have to say about language, that we couldn't get in the room just having a gender conversation, that the conversation had to be centered around how do you get around the men, and how do you sort of like, what's the practical way? So we found that, you know, the usual conversation, or the usual conversation around feminist movements was a no-no from our perspective. We would not actually be able to get in the room. So the language thing was critical, and this is a lot of data asking men how they would approach the conversation, you know, in terms of how do you make this a serious issue? How do you make this not a social issue, but a business issue? I mean, the COVID experience also showed us that, at least on the continent, with private sector getting involved, things move quicker. So if you sort of depend on, you know, African governments or the third sector, we found that we had years of things not going anywhere. But with the COVID experience, I'm sure if you followed the news, you'll have seen how at least Western news were like, oh, Africa was going to be the most decimated continent from COVID. It wasn't. It actually was one of the continents that did the best. And that's because private sector got involved. Again, looking at use of data and how that worked out. So we then said, okay, how are we going to sort of like get men to listen to women? How are we going to get women into the room? And again, the data was speaking to language being a critical. I mean, it's so funny because as of last week, and I'll come back to that, the whole language thing was a core thing from how do you collect data. So anyway, fast forward, we started working with male CEOs to ask them the question, if you were, if this was like, if we're starting from fresh today, how would you engage on the gender issue? And so again, the question around equality, we found here on the continent, and speaking to quite a number of CEOs, that when we said gender equality, that was problematic. So we tweaked language to say gender equity. No one had a problem with that. And this is even when you're speaking to progressive men, progressive thinkers, the conversation around equality and equity became a debate. We found that we couldn't get into rooms with the conversation around equality, but we could with the conversation around designing surveys and questionnaires around equity, still keeping the same meaning, but just sort of like balancing that language. So again, it'll be interesting to see the experiences of the other ladies speaking. And so we then, that's how we launched our Advancing Gender Equity in the Workplace using private sector. And so we had, you know, some of our critical findings where what would move the needle. We sort of focused a lot on men, in terms of we sort of generally know what women want to say or how women feel about core issues. So our question was, what would move the needle if you were a man and you sort of like were a private sector, what would make you do the best for your organization in terms of creating a balanced environment? And the key finding for us was investors and DFIs applying pressure and making compulsory for companies to sort of like say, you have to have a 30% board or 50%. If your investors said so, you would not have a debate about it. The other finding for us was if we had award system and voluntary rating system, so in terms of publicly naming companies who were doing really well in the space. And then we had industry regulators like SEC, the SEC for financial sector, sort of demanding or mandating organizations to have gender balance. And then from our perspective, gender training, and that was very interesting for us because we know that in the US, for example, the trainings have been said not to be so effective. But I think in terms of starting where you're starting from, and I'm looking at time, where you're starting from, trainings for us here on the continent have been effective, or so far so good, just because of the stage of starting where people are not generally interested in the conversation around gender balance. And then the fifth was independent board appointed equality supervisor for companies with over 100 plus employees. And so that's what led us to creating our gender equity commitment tool. It was originally called gender equality commitment tool, but that was a no-no. Again, the gender equality, even for progressive men, we had findings about men not listening to, even the most progressive men sort of tend to tune out women's voices because, you know, the way we speak, shrill, all of that stuff. And so that was interesting in terms of people didn't admit this publicly, but privately they would say, come on, guys, you guys are, you know, like, yeah. So there was an example about a guy saying, I'd listen to my wife going on and on and on at home, and then I have to listen to the same thing at work. But not actually saying that publicly, but saying that privately in a focus group. So those kind of things is how we then learn to design around language and around how do we get ourselves into the room. And in terms of framing our questions, again, being really careful to, you know, around language. So in Nigeria, for example, we have in the Yoruba language, we have something called Egbon. Egbon means, you know, big brother or, you know, daddy or whatever. And that means that automatically that person, there's respect, you have to respect that person. So imagine if the person is your boss and then, you know, says to you, we have to have a meeting at, you know, 12 midnight or whatever it is that they say. And then as a young woman, what do you do? How do you navigate that? So we sort of designed our gender tool around, so creating really, in terms of the African context, nuances in the way that we operate, in the way that we the way that we see things. Understand, we sort of consulted with a number of you know, HR, legal, very senior men to say if, and then again saying to them, could you walk in our shoes? If this was a challenge as a man, how would you resolve it? And so that's how we were informed in terms of our design for our equity tool. Again, language was critical. And as we are about to, I'm just going to quickly, one or two more things before I stop, because I know I'm probably out of time. As we're about to launch, we've had in the past week conversations around, and this is with really progressive institutions who are really very interested in core conversations around gender equity, gender equality. And we have been told that, oh, can you tweak this a little bit more, because, you know, this gender thing is all it's all nice and, you know, all of that, but can you include conversations or sort of questions around ESG and governance so that it's more useful as so that it's more useful as a tool for our organization? Because, you know, this gender thing is a little bit, this is what we've been told by, you know, pretty large public institutions who are looking to onboard. Again, surprising, but maybe not so surprising in terms of getting ourselves in the room. From our philosophy, it's like we want to get in the room. We want to be in the room discussing as opposed to sort of being outside having it perfect. And so sort of like, what are the practical ways for us to get into the room to sort of design around the conversations? And that's what we've been tweaking and trying to understand. And then I think one of the core things that we're also including in our surveys is conversations.
You're on mute.
I think you're muted.
You're on mute. No.
Yeah, now you can use it. Now you can use it.
Nkiru, I think we have to wrap up. We're already 20 minutes
sorry,
in.
okay. Well, I can stop here and I can stop here and then move on. We can move to the next person, and if there's any questions, I can answer.
Super. Thank you so much. Mia.
She's on mute. She's on mute.
You're muted. Hello, hi, sorry, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, okay, great, thank you.
Yes, perfect.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Iris. Thank you so much for inviting me. Iris is one of my icons and idols, so I'm very, very happy to be here. And of course, Aniela, we've been following EDGE for ages and a great inspiration to our work in Latin America. So happy to be here with Aniela and Nkiru. We had a conversation recently and we really hit it off. So I'm very excited. I'll be very, very brief. I know I have 10 minutes. I just want to tell you about what Aequales has been doing in Latin America. So basically, we want to free the workplace through gender equality. I co-founded this organization with Andrea de la Piedra, who is Peruvian, And we decided we wouldn't crash against glass ceilings anymore. It was just not an option for us. We didn't want any other young woman in Latin America to be faced against this. And we decided we would do this hand in hand with corporations. And so we created Aequales. Aequales is a corporation that measures and consults for corporations across Latin America. We created PAR ranking, which is our most prominent service. It is a measurement tool that diagnoses organizations across Latin America in terms of their DEI conditions. We've measured over 2,000 organizations in 18 countries. And then besides that, we help organizations have a business strategy, have policies, practices, and culture that enable them to get places and just further on their standards. And we've done that with over 400 organizations impacting over 17,000 employees. So we do this every 2 years, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we found on our last measurement. And then I also wanted to tell you about what Aequales does with that. So we created a community of organizations that come together and we train every month. They pay an annual fee and we bring them together to be the best in the region. They are over 100. And then finally, we decided it was about time that we had our own certification. So we started last year certifying organizations on DEI issues. After they go through all of this process and they meet a certain standard, we are able to say you are on the path to gender equality and diversity. What does PAR ranking evaluate? So we measure that they have goals, strategies, plans, that they have money, and that they actually have KPIs to know that they're doing things right. We measure culture, we measure sexual harassment, communications, and all other sorts of ways to incorporate employees into DEI issues. Talent management, which is basic, just all human resources, processes, recruitment, promotions, salaries that are incorporated in DEI issues. And then organizational structure, which is just how many women are in the organization, both hierarchically bottom up, and then also horizontally what departments they're in. And then finally, we have opened our ranking to more diversity issues. So now we measure issues that have to do with race, with gender identity, with sexual orientation, and with disability. And this is ingrained in all other categories, but we've also made its own category, which is gender and diversity. So I just want to tell you briefly what were our last conclusions. We've done a very, very brief summary of what happened in 2022. We measured over 700 corporations in 2022 from 18 countries. And you can see that most of them were in Colombia, Peru, and Mexico, but PAR is slowly advancing to the rest of Latin America. And this year, we're already going to measure more organizations in 5 countries in Central America. What have we found? Which is basically why you're here. You want to understand what's going on. From the measurements that we've done, as you can see, women in CEO positions have not dramatically increased. And we spoke about this with Iris in Harvard. It's not really moving. The needle is moving, but it's not moving fast enough, and it's not moving to a place where we can be satisfied. Same for women in boards. Sorry, I forgot to translate that. It means boards of directors. And you can see that it hasn't really increased in time, not as much as we would expect. So really, we have this mirage of women being everywhere and reaching leadership positions, but it's not really happening, not in the data. So what did we find? We find that there's an iceberg, according to what people think that is happening in terms of D&I, and then there's everything else that people don't see. Corporations usually focus on the tip of the iceberg, which is what they have what they call the low-hanging fruits and what they can do easily, but in the end, they're not really solving the structural issues. So most corporations have policies and commitments, and they have International Women's Day, and they have pride campaigns, and they go on the streets and promote pride freedoms. They believe in flexibility. They bring in people to speak about DI, and they think meritocracy is real. I'm not going to go into that. It's controversial. It would take me an hour, but meritocracy is not real. So we can all just keep going to this lesson and understand why that is not happening. And it's basically because of all the barriers that women and other minorities face, which in the end make meritocracy a fallacy. What is really happening underneath the iceberg is that women have way more care work. In Latin America, women have 6 hours more than men every day for care work. That there are stereotypes that tell us what women and men are supposed to and not supposed to do. That there's gender-based violence, that there's racism, And in Latin America, there's a lot of classism, so socioeconomic differences, and people understand how people look, their last names, the way they look, the language, and that's why they discriminate against each other. So we saw this, and we decided that we needed to ask some questions that were relevant for corporations. And these are the three questions that I want to bring to you today. And I'm sorry that I'm rushing, but I'm worried about the rest of the seminar. One size doesn't fit all. We think that we have a policy or a practice, we implement it everywhere, it's going to work. All our corporations in every country, in every city, in every part of the city are going to adapt the same way. And so we decide we have flexibility policies. But then in the end, we're not really looking at the deeper issues, which are we don't have accessible facilities for employees. We don't have specific pathways for transgender people to be recruited and to stay in the workplace. We don't know how much time our people are taking at care work, not just for children, for the elderly or any other person or pets they have to take care of. And only 5% of corporations measured through power ranking, these are all power ranking measurements, have daycare subsidies or in-house daycare facilities. So this is the real issue behind flexibility that we are not tackling. Then there comes the issue of DEI and the backlash, and we are all a little intimidated by it, especially in the States. Fortunately, in Latin America, this is still not as big of an issue. Corporations are still very much talking about gender equality and diversity and wanting to do something about it, but they're still intimidated. We come from a conservative Catholic background, and we're not used to people saying they're non-binary, they're transgender, people don't understand what pronouns are. And I don't think we need to copy that specifically in the sense that we don't need exactly the same language, but we do need to adapt this to understand the diversity that we have in our own region. So 93% of the companies we measured disaggregate the information of their employees by gender, meaning female, male. But then when we look further, only a third of corporations know anything about the sexual orientation of their employees. This doesn't mean we're going to ask each person what their sexual orientation is. That, of course, is illegal. But we can have anonymous surveys or ERGs where people are free to express their own sexuality or not, but at least have the same conditions that would allow them to be the person they are. 4% reported their number of employees with a gender identity different for men or women. They're not even measuring it. So Latin America is only starting to add male, female, other. And so organizations are just understanding that people have more than two sexual gender identities. And then 21% have collected information on self-identified race. There are so many races and nuances in terms of race in Latin America that people are supposed to understand their own race and say if they belong or not. But organizations don't know about this either. So until we have this data, we're not even going to be able to understand what's going on in our corporation and have specific policies and practices that deliver to these people in particular and that open the floor for conversations that are harder. Yes, they're more complex, but at the same time will bring us to the reality of D&I instead of assuming that we know what men, women, and everybody else wants. And my third point, and this is my last one, the world is asking corporations to speak up. So we measure what corporations do beyond their own internal processes. And we understand that most corporations are having external communications, adverts, and publicity that have to do with D&I. This is probably a little more natural for them, but it's a little harder for them to have CSR programs that close gender gaps, so beyond their own employees, that have any work that have to do with their clients or with their vendors. Are we creating products and services that close gender gaps? Are we creating criteria for our vendors, our supply chain, to have the tools to become more DEI friendly instead of assuming that they understand that they're hiring with us, so they probably know that we have a DEI policy? So we have to go beyond our corporation and understand what is going on around us. This was my first take on what Aequales is, what power ranking measures, what our first conclusions from 2022 are. We've been doing this for 10 years, and we're happy to continue understanding what's going on in Latin America and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mia. We'll turn it right over to Aniela.
Thank you. And as Iris said, I'm the data person. So, you know, my experience has always been that, of course, the issues that relate to gender and intersectional equity in the workplace are highly emotional. So 15 years ago, when we started to think of what would be the most effective ways to close the gaps in the workplace, we realized that one of the first things that we need to do from our point of view was to take the emotions out of the equation and then to look at what the data is saying. What is the story that the data is revealing? As you know, everybody has their own opinions and everybody is entitled to their own opinions, but we are not all entitled to our own facts. So we really came through this angle. How can we objectify what is going on inside an organization from a gender binary, but also from an intersectional equity perspective, by looking at the intersection between gender, gender identity, race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, age, working with a disability, and nationality. And let me take you one step backwards. And when we think of an instrument that is very largely used by organizations, that is trusted by their internal and external stakeholders, the financial statements of an organization. So why are the financial statements such a useful tool to understand where an organization stands? It's because the financial statements are based on very clear standards for measurement. So what is included in those financial statements is based on material indicators. So those indicators that matter for showing the health of the organization. The second element is that they are put together according to a certain number of standards of excellence. And the third, they are externally verified. So with this in mind, in saying, well, something that is so close to how an organization functions at its core, financial statements that are this instrument that is transparent, trusted, makes organizations accountable, how can we transpose this into the world of gender and intersectional equity? And this is how we came up with this ecosystem solution that has, on one hand, a software that allows organizations to measure those material indicators, and I will come in 1 second on what they are, to understand where they stand in terms of gender and intersectional equity. How do they compare in their current status with their peers, but also with the standard of excellence in gender and intersectional equity? And therefore, based on that, where do they want to go and where they are on their journey? So this is the software. So imagine this is a work that is continuously taking place by every organization, bringing this very objective view of where they stand. And every now and then, again, just like with the financial statements, there is an independent verification in saying, well, it's here where we are in our journey at this point in time. And this is the second part of the solution, which is the certification. So a software that helps organizations to get the work done, and a certification that makes that work visible and credible to an organization's internal and external stakeholders. So what is being measured? Of course, certifications, as I mentioned, are based on standards. And I remember having the privilege to have worked with Professor Bonnet since the very beginning, 15 years ago, when we were wondering, of course, every industry, every country is unique when it comes to public policies, cultures around gender and intersectional equity. But we do have organizations that are present across many different countries that run global talent policies. And we also have local organizations that want to hold themselves accountable to global standards. So our challenge that we solved for was to find a global standard which can be applied across industries and across geographies when it comes to measuring gender and intersectional equity. And how do we do that? Well, we look at where organizations stand both in terms of outcomes, but also in terms of processes. Of course, a certification system and a robust measurement system needs to look at outcomes because we need to understand at this point in time where an organization stands. But we also need to look at processes, because the health of the processes will point towards where the organization will be in some time for now, and how sustainable the outcomes are. So we are looking at both quantitative and qualitative indicators, both processes and outcomes for both gender and intersectional equity. So in terms of the very quantitative outcome indicators, EDGE measures on one stand representation, but not only the static view of where talents are at a certain moment in the pipeline, but also the different speeds of hiring, promotion, and retention or exits. Because actually it's the result of these three fundamental flows of hiring, promotion, and retention that representation is actually a result of. The second pillar, which is again very quantitative and an outcome, it's pay equity, equal pay for equivalent work. Because of course, what is going on today in terms of pay equity, it's a result of a certain number of decisions that were taken over time in the organization. And coming back to Mia's image that you saw before, that's in our methodology, that's the tip of the iceberg, representation and pay equity. And then we go into the more process-oriented, qualitative aspects. And then we look at the effectiveness of policies and practices to ensure equitable career flows. And we truly measure effectiveness. So not only if policies and practices are formulated, but are they being implemented effectively? In other words, do employees in the organizations know about those policies and practices? Do they use them? And in some cases, why they don't use them? And ultimately, what is the impact of those policies and practices to change the numbers and to change the cultures? So this is the pillar of effectiveness. And then the fourth pillar, it's the pillar of inclusiveness, where we give voice to every single employee in the organization to speak about their career development opportunities. And then we compare if the identity of the employees of our organization is a predictor for their experience for career advancement, or career advancements are actually not correlated with a particular identity. So this is how EDGE measures, again, representation, pay equity in terms of outcomes, and then effectiveness of policies and practices, and inclusiveness of the culture in terms of underlying processes. And I think that over time, over the last 15 years, of course, we have seen a great level of understanding and increasing maturity across organizations on why certain things need to be measured, why standardization is necessary. And I will just conclude by saying that we have always seen gender and intersectional equity pursued for three reasons. Sometimes one of them, sometimes a combination of the three, but gender and intersectional equity in the workplace, it is about commitment, it is about compliance, and it is about competitive advantage. And data is there to prove them all.
On already? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Aniela. In fact, please join me in thanking our panelists for their